The first calf appeared on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878, small and rust-colored with eyes like polished chestnuts, standing at Birdie Barrett's gate as though it had always belonged there. Birdie had risen before the sun that morning, the way she always did, pulling on her worn leather boots and wrapping her mother's old shawl around her shoulders before stepping out into the cold blue air of the Texas Panhandle. She had a list of tasks that stretched longer than the horizon. The fence on the eastern edge needed mending, the smokehouse roof had a gap she could fit her fist through, and the last of the winter stores were running so thin that she had taken to counting out dried beans by the handful. She was 26 years old, living alone on 40 acres that she had inherited from her father 2 years prior when the consumption finally took him, and she had learned in those 2 hard years that loneliness was not a feeling so much as a weather pattern. It simply lived there with her, as constant as the wind. She almost missed the calf entirely. She was pulling open the gate to walk down to the creek with her water buckets when she felt something press against her knee, warm, damp, insistent. She looked down and found the little creature staring back up at her with an expression of total confidence, as though arriving at a stranger's property before dawn was perfectly ordinary behavior. Birdie set her buckets down. She looked out through the gate, down the long, pale stretch of road that cut through the scrubland, and saw nothing. No rider, no wagon. No tracks visible in the dark, just the calf and the wind and the enormous silence of the plains. She brought the calf inside the fence and went about her morning, half convinced it had wandered from some neighboring spread. But Birdie's nearest neighbor was old Clarence Hatch, who kept pigs, not cattle, and the ranch beyond his was the Holloway operation, and the Holloways had sold off everything that moved on 4 legs the previous autumn after the drought took their hay crop. She checked the road again at full sunlight. There were boot prints, a man's, by the size and the faint impressions of hooves in the dust, but they began at the edge of her property and ended at the gate, as though whoever had left this animal had appeared out of the scrub itself and then dissolved back into it. She named the calf Penny on account of the color and fed her from a bucket. The second calf arrived on Wednesday. It was darker than Penny, nearly the color of wet soil, with a white star-shaped marking above one eye. Birdie found it exactly as she had found the first pressed against the gate, warm and unbothered, as though the world was a perfectly safe and welcoming place. She stood at that gate for a long time in the early morning stillness, looking out at the empty road. The boot prints were there again, same wide stride, same even, unhurried spacing between each step. She brought the second calf in and named it Scout, and spent the better part of that morning watching the road from her kitchen window, holding her coffee cup with both hands. Nobody came. Nothing moved except the dry grass bending in the wind and a red-tailed hawk making slow, patient circles over the scrubland. By Thursday she was waiting. She sat on her porch steps before first light, wrapped in her shawl, watching the dark road with sharp eyes. She waited an hour and nothing came. She went inside to start the stove fire, and when she came back out 10 minutes later, there was a third calf at her gate. Smaller than the other 2, pale gold with a spotted nose, already making small hungry sounds. Birdie put her hands on her hips and looked at that calf, and then looked at the empty road stretching in both directions, and said out loud to no one, "All right, I would very much like to know who you are." No answer came from the scrubland. It never did. She brought the gold calf inside and named it Clover. People in town had things to say about the Barrett widow, though Birdie was not a widow, had never been married, which was itself a subject people discussed freely and with great generosity of opinion. The women at the dry goods store in Caldwell spoke of her in voices lowered only by the most modest of fractions, noting that a young woman alone on 40 acres was asking for trouble, and that her father should have seen to her settling before he passed. The men at the feed store spoke of her differently, with a kind of careful respect that had been earned the hard way, because Birdie Barrett had once driven a hammer into the top rail of her fence from the back of a moving horse, and there were witnesses. She was not soft. She had her mother's wide-set eyes, green as creek water, and her father's jaw, which had the look of something carved rather than grown. She was tall for a woman and moved with the economical purposefulness of someone who had never had the luxury of wasted motion. She could rope, she could brand, she could set a bone if she had to. She had set her own finger once, 2 winters ago, when the woodpile shifted and caught her hand. But even Birdie Barrett, with all of her self-contained capability, found that 3 calves and a mystery war on a person. She told herself she was not charmed. She told herself she was annoyed. She spent the 4th morning before dawn sitting on the top rail of her fence with a lantern and a direct view of the entire road in both directions, and she did not see so much as a shadow move. The 4th calf was already at the gate when she climbed down. It was enormous by comparison to the others, a blocky, amiable creature the color of cream with brown patches, who looked at Birdie with the mournful resignation of a philosopher. She named it Judge because of the expression, and stood there in the early morning dark with her lantern and her confusion, and a feeling she could not quite name that had begun somewhere in her chest during the night, and was spreading in an uncomfortable and inconvenient direction. Whoever was leaving these calves was not doing it by accident. The animals were healthy, well-fed, and gentle enough that they had clearly been handled. The timing was deliberate, always before light, always while she was briefly inside. Someone knew her routine, and that someone had spent 4 mornings delivering animals of real value to her gate without asking a single thing in return. She rode into Caldwell that afternoon, 4 calves loaded into the back of the wagon with Scout sitting on top of the others like a king. She asked around at the livery, at the feed store, at the small hotel that also served as a saloon in the evenings. Had anyone seen a drifter come through, someone traveling alone, a man who kept cattle? Old Hector at the livery scratched his chin. He said there had been a man through 2 or 3 weeks back, bought grain and some rope and paid in coin without much talk. Tall fellow, he said, wore a coat that had been good quality once, rode a gray horse, had a small herd with him, maybe 20 head. Nobody had caught a name. Birdie drove home with the calves and thought about the tall man in the good coat on the gray horse for the rest of the afternoon. On the 5th morning she found a calf and a note. The note was stuck to the top rail of the gate with a short piece of wire, a piece of brown paper folded twice. The handwriting was careful, the letters a little cramped, as though the writer had not had much cause for writing lately but was trying his best. It said, "I know these are unusual circumstances. I don't mean any offense or trouble. The animals are mine to give. If you want me to stop, tie something red on the fence." There was no name. Birdie read the note 3 times. Then she looked up and down the road and found it empty as always. She put the note in her apron pocket and brought the 5th calf in, this one a deep reddish-brown with black legs, and she named it Ink, and went about her morning with the note pressed against her hip, rustling faintly when she moved. She did not tie anything red on the fence. She also took out a piece of paper that evening and sat at the table by the lamp and wrote a response. Why? She folded it the same way he had folded his, and she wired it to the gate just before she went to bed, and she stood at her bedroom window for a long time in the dark watching the road before she finally convinced herself to sleep. In the morning the paper was gone, and there was a 6th calf and a 2nd note. His 2nd note said, "You have good land, but you're working it alone, and the fence on your east side won't hold through summer. I have more cattle than I need and more fence materials than I can use. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just trying to be useful to someone who deserves it." Birdie sat on the porch steps and read that note 4 times. The sun was barely up, and the air was still cool and sharp. Penny and Scout and Clover and Judge and Ink were moving around in the small pen she had set up near the barn, their voices rising and falling in easy conversation. The 6th calf, she would call this 1 Star, she decided, for the shape of the marking on its forehead pressed its nose against the fence rail and looked at her with those enormous liquid eyes. She thought about the word deserves. She thought about what it meant that a man she had never seen had watched her property long enough to know the east fence was weak, and had drawn the conclusion that she deserved better from the world. She thought about how long it had been since anyone had used that word in relation to her, and how the last person to do it had been her father in his last weeks, when he was very ill and very tired and kept saying, "Birdie, you deserve a life that doesn't cost you so much." She wrote back, "What is your name?" His reply arrived with the seventh calf, "Daniel Barnett, yours." She had not expected him to ask. She found it was the asking that undid something in her, some last remaining wall of caution that she had been holding in place through sheer force of will. She wrote, "Birdie Barrett, this is my father's land, it's my land now." He wrote back one morning later, "I know. I asked about it when I came through Caldwell. I'm sorry about your father." She wrote, "Did you know him?" He wrote, "No, but people spoke well of him." These morning exchanges became a part of her day as fixed and necessary as water. She found herself composing sentences in her head during the afternoon, thinking of things she wanted to tell the man with the careful handwriting and the steady boot prints and the endless supply of calves. She wrote to him about the east fence, and he left, with the ninth calf, a length of good cedar rail and a bag of iron nails. She came home from mending fences to find a pot of coffee still warm on her porch step, and beside it a small bundle of wildflowers tied with a piece of grass, and she stood there looking at that bundle for a very long time before she carried everything inside. She wrote, "You left me coffee and flowers." He wrote, "The coffee was practical, the flowers were not. I apologize for the flowers if they were presumptuous." She wrote, "They were not presumptuous." She pressed the bundle into the back of her Bible where it would dry flat and keep, and she was aware that this was a sentimental action, and she did it anyway. By the third week she had 11 calves, a mended east fence, a patched smokehouse roof, the materials for which had appeared one morning stacked neatly beside the barn, and a correspondence that had grown from brief practical notes into something else entirely. Daniel Barnett wrote about the land, about the way the panhandle light hit the grass at certain hours and turned it the color of old gold. He wrote about the cattle business, about the long drives he had done up through Kansas, about the particular loneliness of nights on the trail when the sky was so full of stars it felt less like beauty and more like pressure. He wrote about a horse he had once owned named Ptolemy, who had been the most difficult and most loved animal he had ever known, and who had died of a snake bite in a creek bed in 1875. And how he still sometimes reached for that horse's reins in the dark before remembering. Birdie wrote back with equal honesty, which surprised her. She wrote about her father, about the consumption that had taken him slowly and then quickly, about the grief that had first felt like drowning, and then settled into something she wore like an old coat, always present, gradually less heavy. She wrote about Penny and Scout and Clover and Judge and Ink and Star and the others, about how the calves made the place feel less empty, about how embarrassed she was to admit that she was grateful for them because she understood what gratitude cost and what it implied. She wrote about the loneliness, not the word exactly, but around it, the way you write around a fire because you cannot write about the fire itself without burning the page. He wrote back, "I understand loneliness the same way." She believed him. She did not know why she believed him so completely, but she did. She believed him the way you believe in weather, not because you have proven it scientifically, but because you have stood in it enough times to know it for a fact. It was on the morning of the 14th calf that she made her decision. She was at the gate before first light. She had been making a habit of this, trying to catch him, though he had proven himself a ghost in the early morning and the calf was already there. 14 calves. 2 weeks of notes. A man who left coffee and flowers and cedar rails and did not ask for anything in return, who wrote about loneliness and stars and a dead horse as though she was the kind of person he could tell those things to. She was done with notes. She went inside and wrote one last one, wired it to the gate, and began saddling her horse. The note said, "I am riding out to find you today. Please don't disappear." She took the roan mare, whose name was Harriet, and she rode out in the early morning with the sun just beginning to crack the edge of the sky. She had not been told where Daniel Barnett was camped, had never asked, and she understood this was both an oversight and a test. She had to want to find him enough to actually look. She followed the boot prints first. They were familiar to her by now, the wide stride, the even weight distribution of a man who walked with balance and no hurry. The prints led west from her gate into the scrubland, for nearly a mile, before they became confused with the hoofprints of what appeared to be a modest-sized cattle herd. She followed the hoofprints on general principle, along the dry wash that ran parallel to the road, through a stand of cottonwood trees whose roots had found the underground water the visible creek had abandoned years ago. The camp was in a hollow on the far side of the cottonwoods, well hidden and well organized. A canvas shelter strung between two trees, a fire pit that had been used carefully, the ash spread and the stones rearranged over weeks of habitation. A remuda of 4 horses, including one gray whose quality was visible from 50 yards. And cattle, she counted quickly, maybe 18 head grazing on the rough grass at the bottom of the hollow. Daniel Barnett was sitting on a log at the edge of the camp, drinking coffee from a tin cup, and he saw her the moment she came through the cottonwoods. He was not what she had imagined, or rather he was not what she had imagined in the precise way that real people are never quite what imagination builds. He was tall. Hector at the livery had been right about that, with the kind of lean build that came from years of hard physical work rather than anything voluntary. His hair was dark and a little long at the collar, his face was weather brown and angular, and his eyes, which she could see clearly even at this distance, were the specific quiet gray of a cloudy day that might break into sun or might not, and which you cannot predict by looking. He was perhaps 30, she thought, maybe a year or two on either side of it, the kind of age that has been lived in rather than simply arrived at. He stood up when he saw her, slowly, the way a man stands when he is not sure if he is welcome to stand up yet. He had his coffee cup in one hand and his other hand at his side, open, which she noted, an old habit of her father's, showing open hands to strangers in a country where the distinction between stranger and threat was frequently relevant. Birdie rode Harriet to the edge of the camp and stopped. She looked at Daniel Barnett and he looked at her. The morning light was coming in at a low angle through the cottonwood leaves and everything around them was very still. She said, "You left me 14 calves." He said, "Yes," she said, "and coffee and flowers and enough cedar to mend my east fence properly." He said, "The fence needed mending." She said, "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment before he answered, and she had the sense that he was choosing words the way you choose where to put your foot on uncertain ground, carefully, testing each one before committing. "I came through Caldwell in March," he said. "I stopped because one of my horses threw a shoe. I was only going to be there a day or two. But I rode past your place and I saw you working and I stopped and watched for a while, not to be intrusive. I stopped." He paused. She waited. "You were mending a section of fence on the south side," he said. "You did it exactly right and you did it alone and you did not look like it was hard for you, but I could see from the way you moved that you were tired. And when you finished, you stood at that fence and you looked out at the land and there was something in how you looked at it like you were both grateful for it and carrying it." He paused again. "I had all these cattle, too many for one man, and I thought she could use these. And then I thought about riding up to your gate like a stranger asking for what? A favor, an arrangement. I didn't want it to seem like an arrangement." Birdie said, "What did you want it to seem like?" He said, "I didn't know yet. That's the honest answer." She looked at him for a long time. A redbird called somewhere in the cottonwoods. One of the horses shifted and snorted softly. She said, "I thought about tying something red on the fence." He said, "But you didn't." "No," she said, "I didn't." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of silence between two people who have already said a great deal to each other and are simply resting between sentences. She dismounted and tied Harriet's reins loosely to a branch, and she walked to the log where he had been sitting, and she sat down on it. After a moment he sat down beside her, a careful distance away, and poured coffee into a second tin cup and set it in front of her on a flat stone. She said, "How long have you been moving?" He said, "4 years." She said, "Before that," he said, "I had a place in New Mexico Territory, small ranch. My wife and I built it together." He paused. "She died in the winter of 1874, fever. It was very fast, 3 days from the first sign of it to the end." Birdie said, "I'm sorry," he said. "Her name was Clara. She was kind. She made the best cornbread you ever tasted, which sounds like a small thing, but I've thought about it an embarrassing number of times since." He looked into his coffee cup. "After she died, I couldn't stay. I sold the land and took the cattle and started moving. I told myself I was looking for better grass, better markets. But the truth is I was just moving because moving was easier than stopping." Birdie said, "Until you stopped here." He looked at her then. "Until I stopped here." She wrapped her hands around the tin cup and let the warmth soak into her palms. Around them the hollow was coming alive with the ordinary sounds of morning birds in the cottonwoods, cattle shifting, the small fire breathing quietly. She said, "What do you want, Daniel Barnett?" It was a direct question, and she meant it directly. She was not a woman who had the patience for indirection. He seemed to understand this. He seemed, in fact, to appreciate it. He said, "I want to stop moving. I want to be useful somewhere to someone who actually needs the kind of useful I know how to be. I want to have land under me that's mine and not just somewhere I'm passing through." He paused. "And I would very much like to keep talking to you. Those notes they've been the best part of every day for 3 weeks, if that doesn't sound ridiculous." She said, "It doesn't sound ridiculous." He said, "What do you want?" Nobody had asked her that in 2 years. She sat with the question for a moment, taking it seriously the way it deserved. She said, "I want the ranch to survive. I want the east fence to hold. I want to stop counting dried beans." She paused. "I want to not be alone on that land anymore. Not because I can't manage it, I can, but because there's too much of it. There's too much of everything out here for one person to hold." He nodded as though this made complete sense to him, which she supposed it did. She said, "I should tell you something about the way I am." He said, "All right," she said, "I am not easy. I have a temper and I have opinions and I have a way of doing things that I have been doing alone for long enough that it is probably very fixed by now. I don't make agreements I can't keep, and I don't say things I don't mean, which means sometimes I am silent when another person might say something kind and soft. I'm not always soft." He said, "I understand that." She said, "You should know that before anything happens." He said, "What do you think is going to happen?" She looked at him sidelong, with a small tightening at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. She said, "I think you should come have supper at my place tonight and we'll see." He came to supper. He arrived at dusk, having driven the cattle down the road in a loose group, and settled them into the field adjacent to hers. Her neighbor Clarence watched from his fence with an expression of comprehensive bewilderment, and he knocked on her door in his good coat, which she could see in better light now had been a very fine coat indeed, dark wool with brass buttons, worn soft at the elbows but still dignified. She had made a proper supper, salt pork and beans and cornbread, because she had been thinking of what he said about Clara's cornbread, and she had decided, without being entirely sure why, that she wanted her own cornbread to exist in his memory. She was a practical woman. She was also, she was slowly discovering, a woman with more feeling in her than she had lately been giving herself credit for. They sat at her kitchen table and ate together, and the conversation was natural and easy in a way that surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. They had been writing to each other for weeks and had covered a great deal of ground already. He told her about the cattle drives, about the particular democracy of the trail where a man's usefulness mattered more than his history, about the communities of drovers he had traveled with, and the strange kinship of people who sleep under the same sky for months at a stretch. She told him about growing up on this land, about learning to ride before she was properly tall enough to mount without a fence, about her father's way of teaching, which was largely to point at things and say figure it out, and about how that particular method had produced in her both extreme competence and a lifelong mild resentment of ambiguity. He laughed at that. A real laugh, surprised and warm, and the sound of it in the kitchen felt like something that belonged there, like it fit the room. After supper they sat on the porch as the sky went through its evening performance, which in the Panhandle was always dramatic and excessive, all orange and deep rose and purple, a sky that took being a sky very seriously. The calves were visible in the pen, settled into their evening quiet, a pile of soft, warm shapes in the fading light. Daniel said, "You named them all." Birdie said, "Of course I named them." He said, "What do you call them?" She listed them: Penny, Scout, Clover, Judge, Ink, Star, and continued through the rest. When she got to the fourth, whose name was Ptolemy, he went very still. She said without looking at him, "I liked the name." "You said the horse had a good name." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Yes, he did have a good name." She said, "I hope that doesn't upset you." He said, "It doesn't upset me. It's the opposite of upsetting me." She nodded as though this was a settled matter, which she supposed it was. He left late that evening, after the stars were fully out, walking back toward the road with a lantern she had lent him. She watched from the porch until the light disappeared around the bend. The night was very clear and very still and full of that enormous Panhandle sky. She put her hand in her apron pocket and felt the outline of the first note, which she had carried there every day without quite deciding to. He came back the next morning and the morning after that, and by the end of that week he had built himself a simple camp on the far edge of her property, not in the house, not invited there, but near enough that she could see the smoke from his fire in the morning, and it did something to the quality of the air around the place. Made it different. Made it, she would admit to herself only in the privacy of her own mind, considerably better. He worked. This she had not anticipated as a surprise, but it surprised her anyway, the steadiness of it, the wordless competence. He could read the land's needs the way she could, without being told. She would come out of the barn to find him already working on the things she had been planning to work on that afternoon. Once she came around the corner of the house to find him on the roof fixing the chimney cap that had been loose since January, and she stood in the yard looking up at him, and he looked down and she said, "How did you know about that?" And he said, "I could see it from the road the first time I rode past." And she said, "That was months ago." And he said, "Yes," simply, without making any more of it than that. They worked together well. Not because they agreed on everything, they did not, and their disagreements were lively and occasionally quite loud, on the subject of grazing rotation and fence placement, and the proper way to treat a calf that was refusing the bucket. But they argued in the same language, and they listened to each other with the same care, and they reached decisions by the same process, and Birdie, who had spent years doing everything alone, found to her amazement that the presence of another voice in these decisions did not feel like a loss of control but something more like relief, like putting down a weight you had been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was heavy. The town noticed, of course. The town noticed everything. The woman at the dry goods store, a Mrs. Paulette Greer, whose confidence in her own opinions was a force of nature, told Birdie one afternoon in May, while weighing out flour, that it was very imprudent to allow a stranger of unknown reputation onto one's property, particularly a drifter, and that the wise course would be to get Sheriff Tanner's opinion on the matter before the situation became any more established. Birdie paid for her flour and said, "I thank you for your concern, Mrs. Greer," which was a sentence she had constructed specifically to be polite without agreeing with anything, and she carried the flour out to the wagon. But there were other voices. Old Hector at the livery, who had apparently had a longer conversation with Daniel when he came through in March than he had let on, said to her when she brought in Harriet for a new shoe, "That Barnett is a decent hand by all accounts. I've heard of him from men who worked a drive with him out of Abilene 3 years back. He's straight." He paused and added, with the laconic authority of a man who had been watching people for 60 years, "Straight men are rarer than cattle in this country." Birdie thought about that. She thought about it quite a bit. In the evenings, Daniel ate supper at her table more nights than not, and they talked. They talked about everything, about the land and the cattle and the approaching summer, and what the market prices in Wichita were looking like, and what needed doing to the barn before fall. But also about other things. About the books they had each managed to carry through their various chapters of living. His were a worn King James Bible and a dog-eared copy of a natural history that he had read so many times the binding had given up entirely. Hers were an agricultural almanac and a novel that had belonged to her mother, a romance of the Scottish moors that Birdie read in private and would not have admitted to reading in public. He somehow knew about the novel. He mentioned it once briefly, having glimpsed the spine on the shelf, and she waited for him to say something that would require her to be defensive, and he simply said, "My wife likes stories like that," and smiled and moved on. She liked him. She liked him very much, and the liking had become something else, something that pulled toward him in a way she recognized because she had been careful her whole life not to feel it in directions that couldn't go anywhere. She recognized it because the recognition was uncomfortable. It meant she could be hurt. It meant she was already in a position where his continued presence mattered to her, where the thought of him saddling his gray horse and moving on down the road made something in her chest feel like a door slamming in a cold wind. She was not a woman who hid things from herself, generally speaking, but she held this one for a few more weeks, turning it over privately, testing its weight and its tensile strength, making sure it wasn't made of something that would break. It was in early June when he told her he had been looking at a parcel of land. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the way they had come to do, and the air was warm and full of the smell of evening grass, and somewhere down by the creek the frogs were carrying on enthusiastically. He said it in the same tone he used for everything practical, straightforward, no excess drama, that there was a section of land to the northwest of hers, 80 acres, going for a fair price, and he had spoken to the land agent in Caldwell and was thinking about making an offer. Birdie said, "To the northwest." He said, "Your property would border it on the east and south sides." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You're thinking of settling here." He said, "I have been thinking of settling here since the first morning I left a calf at your gate, if I'm being honest." She said, "You're always honest." He said, "I try to be." She said, "Daniel." She paused, looking out at the darkening field where the cattle were settling into their evening quiet. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight." He said, "Of course." She said, "Is the land what you want to settle, or is it something else?" He turned to look at her. In the long blue evening light, his face was very clear and very still. He said, "Birdie, the land is not what I want to settle." She turned to look at him. He said, "I have been trying to find a way to say this to you that doesn't sound like it came out of nowhere, which it hasn't. It's been building in me since those first notes. Maybe before, but I'm aware that you said you're not easy, and I know that to mean you want things said plainly and not dressed up." He paused. "I want to stay here, near you. I want to keep eating supper at your table and working on this land beside you. I would like to court you if you'd allow it. Properly. Whatever that means to you." She looked at him for a long time. The frogs in the creek were very enthusiastic. The stars were coming out one at a time overhead. She said, "You've been courting me with calves for 2 months." He said, "I suppose that's true." She said, "It was a very effective strategy." He said very quietly, "Was it?" She said, "Yes." She looked at her hands clasped in her lap and then back at him. "I'm not a woman who says things she doesn't mean, as I told you. So I will say this and mean it. I think about you all day. When you're here, I am more myself than I have been in 2 years. When you leave in the evenings, I watch the lantern until it's gone, and I don't like the going." She paused. "That's what I have. It's not poetry," he said. "It's better than poetry." She said, "Don't buy the land to the northwest." He looked at her, an expression of very careful attention. She said, "This land is 40 acres. My father always said it should be more. The 2 sections together would be a proper ranch." She paused, and the next sentence cost her something, not a painful cost, more the cost of a door opening on a room you've been afraid to enter because you wanted what was in it too much. "Buy the land to the northwest and farm it beside me, as a partner, and we'll see what comes of that. If it goes where I think it goes, then we'll handle that when we get there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is either the most practical proposal I have ever heard or the most romantic one." "I'm not sure which," she said. "It's both. I am both." He said, "Birdie Barrett." She said, "Daniel Barnett." He said, "I'm going to buy that land." She said, "Good." He said, "And then I'm going to come to supper tomorrow." She said, "I'll make cornbread." He smiled at her then, full and unhurried, and it was a particular kind of smile, the kind that reorganizes the face that produces it and does the same to the face that receives it. She felt it somewhere well below her sternum. He bought the land in the second week of June. The deed was drawn up at the office of a Mr. Frederick Ames, land agent in Caldwell, and Birdie went with him to the signing because she wanted to see the face of the thing made official. The land agent was a thin, fussy man with spectacles and an opinion about nearly everything, and he said several things in the course of the transaction that implied he was confused about the nature of the arrangement between these two people, to which both Birdie and Daniel responded with the kind of civil non-engagement that communicated without words that it was not Mr. Frederick Ames's business. Walking out of the land agent's office into the dusty June sunshine of Caldwell's Main Street, Daniel held the door open for her, and she stepped through, and then they were standing on the boardwalk with the deed in his hand and the whole wide sky overhead, and she laughed unexpectedly. A real laugh, because it was such a solid, actual thing. He looked at her laughing and laughed too, and they stood there on the boardwalk of Caldwell, Texas, in 1878, laughing like people who have been given a very good piece of news. Mrs. Paulette Greer, who had the particular gift of always being present when events occurred, watched from the window of the dry goods store and later told everyone that the Barrett woman and the drifter had been out on the boardwalk, carrying on like they had not a care in the world, which was true. The summer was a working summer, the best kind. Daniel brought his cattle onto the northwest section and integrated the herd with Birdie's growing stock. The 14 calves had been the beginning, and between the two herds they now had a respectable operation, enough to drive a portion to market in the fall and come home with real money. They built fence together along the boundary between the two sections, which was a largely symbolic exercise since in practical terms they were working the land as a single entity, and they both understood this without needing to discuss it. They dug a new well on his section that hit water at 30 feet and celebrated the striking of it with a supper of such ambition. She roasted a chicken and made 2 kinds of pie because she was feeling ambitious, that Daniel sat back at the end of it with an expression of profound contentment and said that this was the best meal he had eaten since 1873, which was a specific enough claim that she believed it. In July, there was a trouble. Birdie had half expected a trouble eventually, because the Panhandle was that kind of place, and the summer of 1878 was that kind of summer, dry and hot with tempers running as thin as the water in the creek beds. The trouble arrived in the form of 2 men named Cord Weston and his younger brother Dix, who had a spread about 12 miles east of Caldwell, and a long history of land disputes with every neighbor they had ever been adjacent to. They had it in their minds that a portion of the northwest section Daniel had purchased properly and legally from Frederick Ames actually belonged to them by virtue of an old survey that had been wrong to begin with and corrected 30 years ago, and they chose a Tuesday afternoon to ride onto the northwest section and say so, loudly, from horseback. Birdie happened to be on that section when they arrived, working a section of fence near the northern boundary, and she heard the horses before she saw them. She set down her tools and stood up straight and watched the 2 men ride toward her. She had her rifle in the scabbard on her saddle, and her saddle was 20 feet away, and she did not move toward it. Cord Weston was a big man going soft around the middle, with a beard that needed acquainting with scissors. He said, in a voice designed to take up a lot of space, that this land was spoken for, and the new deed didn't amount to a hill of beans because the original survey line ran through here, and the correct line had never been registered. Birdie said, calm as creek water, that the county registrar's office in Caldwell had on file a corrected survey from 1847, and that Mr. Frederick Ames had searched the title thoroughly before completing the sale, and that she would be happy to ride into town with them right now if they wanted to look at the paperwork together. Cord Weston's face did an interesting sequence of things. He was not a man accustomed to a woman producing counterarguments. While this was happening, Daniel came over the low rise from the direction of the creek, having heard the voices. He came on foot and he came unhurried, and he positioned himself beside Birdie without a word, and looked at the two men on horseback with the particular expression of a man who is not angry yet but is prepared to be, and who has a fair amount of patience for this kind of conversation, and also a definite end to that patience. Dix Weston, who was younger and not quite as committed to the confrontation as his brother, said to Cord, "Maybe we ought to look at those papers." Cord Weston looked at Daniel, and then at Birdie, and then back at Daniel, doing the calculation that men like him were always doing in situations like this, which was the calculation of whether the result of continuing this confrontation would be worth the cost. He clearly decided it would not be, at least not today. He wheeled his horse and said he'd be talking to his lawyer, which meant he had no lawyer, and rode back east with Dix following. Daniel watched them go and then looked at Birdie and said, "You were very calm," she said. "I had the facts." He said, "You also had the rifle in the scabbard," she said. "I had that too." He smiled slowly. She thought there was admiration in it. She thought she did not mind that. They rode into Caldwell the next morning and spoke with the sheriff, a competent man named Tanner who had known Robert Barrett and treated Birdie with the kind of steady, respectful attention that spoke well of him. Sheriff Tanner noted the corrected survey on file and said he would have a word with the Weston brothers, and that was, more or less, the end of the trouble with the Westons. They appeared once more in August at the far edge of the property, and when Birdie and Daniel rode out together to the fence line to meet them, the two Weston brothers looked at each other and turned around and went home without saying a word. That was the end of it. August softened the land and the people on it in a way that the fierce burning heat of July did not. The evenings were long and warm and full of fireflies down near the creek, and after supper Birdie and Daniel had fallen into a habit of walking the land in the long evening light, not always talking, just moving together across the ground they had each chosen. It was in these walks that the relationship between them became something she would not have known how to describe to anyone who had not experienced it. Not romantic in the showy sense, not performed or demonstrated, but present in the most basic way. Present in the way that she did not think about her feet when she walked because they knew how to walk. Present in the way the sun was present, not conspicuous until you imagined its absence. He took her hand on one of those evenings, somewhere in mid-August, just picked it up as they walked, the way you pick up something that belongs to you. She looked down at their joined hands and then looked up at him, and he was looking straight ahead at the darkening field, and she thought, yes, that is exactly right. He did not let go until they were back at the porch. He kissed her on a Thursday evening in late August, on the porch after supper, when the air had that specific summer almost over quality of concentrated warmth that smells like grass and dust and distant rain. He stopped at the top of the porch steps as she was about to go inside, and he said, "Birdie," very quietly, and she turned, and he was right there, closer than the usual careful distance he kept, and she thought, clear as a bell, "I have been waiting for this." Not impatiently, not anxiously. Just waiting, the way you wait for something you know is coming, and you don't want to rush because the coming of it is also part of the gift. He kissed her with great gentleness, one hand at her jaw, and she kissed him back with more than gentleness, her hand against his chest where she could feel the solid, steady fact of his heartbeat. When they drew apart, he looked at her and she looked at him, and the evening light was doing something spectacular behind his shoulders, and she thought that she must look equally absurd in it, backlit and bright-eyed, and she did not care. She said, "I should tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I am very much in love with you." The words came out plainly the way she had said she always did things. No decoration, just the fact of it offered directly. He said, "Birdie Barrett." He paused. "I have been in love with you since the morning you asked me why in that note with the very careful handwriting. Before that, possibly. I don't know exactly when it started. I know it hasn't stopped," she said. "That is a very satisfying answer." He said, "I am glad." She said, "Come to supper tomorrow." He said, "I will come to supper tomorrow and every day after that for as long as you want me to." She said, "I want you to." He came to supper the next day and the day after that and the day after that. And in September, when the air began its slow turn toward autumn and the cottonwoods started their gold, he did not go back to his camp on the northwest section every evening. He stayed, not because it was assumed and not because it was rushed, but because one evening after supper she said, "It is cold tonight and your camp is a poor substitute for a roof." And he said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "I have been sure for longer than I have admitted." And that was the end of the question. He moved what he had into the house, which was not much. A man traveling for 4 years accumulates very little, and she realized looking at his belongings that she had never thought about how light he carried himself until this moment. His Bible, the natural history, the coat, a few tools. A photograph he kept wrapped in cloth, which she understood was Clara without his needing to say so, and which she set on the shelf beside her mother's novel without comment, because the dead did not need to be put away, they just needed to be arranged alongside the living. He saw her do that, the placing of the photograph, and he did not say anything. But he looked at her with something in his eyes that she recognized as love in its most serious form, not the high feeling, not the warmth, but the particular quality of seeing someone do a thing that is kind and true and feeling yourself permanently changed by the seeing of it. The fall drive was successful. They drove 62 head north toward the Kansas line, met a buyer at a prearranged point who had come down from Wichita, and came home with enough money to winter well and make some improvements that had been waiting. Birdie bought glass for the 2 windows that had been shuttered since the frame warped 2 years ago, and the light they let in on the first clear morning she opened them was something almost shocking in its abundance. Daniel built new shelving in the kitchen and a proper feed storage room off the barn, and Birdie stood looking at these additions with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has watched something she loves become more itself. He asked her to marry him in October, standing in the kitchen where the new windows were letting in the fall afternoon light, gold and slanted, falling across the table where they had eaten 100 suppers already and the floor she had swept 1,000 times. He did not go down on a knee. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and said, "I want to be your husband. I want to do this properly, and I want it to be legal, and I want your name to be next to mine on every document from here on out." "If you'll have me," she said, "we already share our land and our table and our nights." He said, "I know. I want to share everything else too." She said, "Daniel Barnett, yes." He smiled the slow, full smile, and she thought, "There it is. There is the thing I was waiting for when I didn't know I was waiting for anything." They were married in November by the circuit preacher, who came through Caldwell every 6 weeks, and who performed the ceremony in the sitting room of the Barnett property on a gray November afternoon with old Hector from the livery as witness and Clarence Hatch, who had recovered from his bewilderment over the cattle and turned out to be a good-natured man, as the second. Mrs. Paulette Greer sent a jar of preserves and a note of congratulations, which Birdie received with the graciousness it deserved. They were married. They were genuinely, solidly, finally married, and Birdie stood at the kitchen window that evening looking out at the land, her land, their land, all 120 acres of it now officially consolidated under both their names, and felt the particular peace of a person who has arrived at a place they have been traveling toward without knowing the destination. Daniel came and stood behind her, his arms around her, both of them looking out at the November evening coming down over the plains. He said against her hair, "Birdie Barnett," she said, "I'm keeping Barrett." He said, I know, she said, but Barnett too, both. He said, Barrett Barnett, that's a lot of bees. She said, it is. He said, I like it. She turned in the circle of his arms and put her hands against his face, and looked at him in the fading light, and thought about the morning she had ridden through the cottonwoods, and found him sitting on a log with a coffee cup, and his open hands and his careful gray eyes, and thought about everything between that morning and this one. All the fence posts and calves and letters and suppers and walks and silences and arguments and apologies and evenings on the porch, and the image of the lantern going away down the road that she had watched every night, and the image of it now never going away because it was already home. She said, I'm glad you stopped. He said, I was always going to stop, I just didn't know where yet. She said, this is where. He said, yes, this is where. The winter was hard in the way that panhandle winters were hard, a thing of cold, clear skies and frozen ground and short days that made the evenings long and the long evenings very much their own. They survived it easily, more than survived, inhabited it. The calves were fat and healthy. The cattle on both sections had been brought close to the barn for the worst of it, and fed from the stores that Daniel's new feed room kept organized and dry. The new windows let in every thin gray inch of winter light that existed, and in the evenings the stove was well fed, and the kitchen was warm, and they ate together, and read together, and talked together, and were so simply and completely present in each other's company that Birdie sometimes paused in the middle of an ordinary moment and felt the weight of it, the solid, specific gravity of being genuinely happy. She had not been genuinely happy, as distinct from capable and functional and grateful for the good parts of things, since before her father got sick. She had not known she was without it until it came back. This is how it is with things that leave slowly. In February she told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning at breakfast, very directly, the way she did everything, Daniel, I'm going to have a child, and watched his face do something wonderful and unguarded. He put down his coffee cup very carefully, as though the cup was suddenly fragile, and then he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would remember her entire life, a kind of struck awe that sat on his angular weather-browned face as gently as anything she had ever seen. He said, Are you well? Are you feeling well? She said, I'm fine, I'm healthy. He said, Of course you are. A pause. Birdie, she said, you're going to say something emotional. He said, I am. I'm going to say something extremely emotional. She said, Go ahead. He said, I did not think I was going to have this. After Clara, I didn't. He paused, collected himself with a visible effort. I did not think I was going to have another chance at this. A family. This. And you walked out through those cottonwoods on a gray horse and sat down on my log, and I thought, I have no right to this, but I am going to try with everything I have. She reached across the table and took both his hands. She said, You didn't just try, you did it. He said, We did it. She said, Yes, we did. He was relentlessly attentive without being fussy about it, which she appreciated. He did not attempt to restrict her or hover over her in a way that suggested she had become less herself, because she was carrying a child. Birdie Barrett Barnett carrying a child was still Birdie Barrett Barnett, and she worked through April and May and into early June, though he quietly took on more of the heavy work without being asked. She noticed him doing it and chose not to challenge it because it came from love, and because she was, in fact, more tired than she would have admitted. The child was born in September of 1879, a boy, healthy and demanding and possessed from his first hour of a particularly imperious expression that reminded Birdie immediately of Judge the Calf, and she almost said so out loud and managed not to. They named him Robert Daniel Barrett Barnett, for her father and for his, and called him Robbie from the first day. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and the particular combination of these features in a baby's face was remarkable. Birdie looked at him in the first hours and felt something so large and complex that it had no single name, a kind of love that was different from everything else she had felt, more immediate and more ancient at once, as though it had existed before she did. Daniel held Robbie on the first evening while Birdie slept, sitting in the chair by the window with the baby against his chest, and she woke to the sight of him in the lamplight, this man who had ridden past her gate years ago and stopped because of the way she looked at her land, holding their son with the same careful, open-handed attention he brought to everything. She watched him for a long time before he knew she was awake. Then he looked over and found her watching and smiled. He said, soft and very warm, "Hello." She said, "Hello." He said, "He is very small." She said, "He is exactly the right size." He said, "Yes, he is." The first year of Robbie's life was exhausted and brilliant, and full of the kind of comedy that infants introduced into an otherwise serious household. Birdie, who had managed a ranch alone for 2 years with competence and grim determination, was briefly undone by a 10-pound baby, which she found both humbling and remarkably funny in retrospect. Daniel, who had not been around infants in his adult life, brought to the endeavor his characteristic steady patience, and the result was that the three of them, by trial and error and occasional very bad nights, became a family in all the fullest and most lived-in sense of the word. Penny and Scout and Clover and Judge and Ink and Star and Ptolemy, and all the rest of the calves had grown into proper cattle by now, the original 14 forming the nucleus of the herd, their presence a kind of ongoing joke between Birdie and Daniel about how you went about courtship in the Panhandle. Daniel had told her once, a little embarrassed, that he had agonized over the first calf, had stood at her gate in the dark for 20 minutes deciding whether to leave it or take it back. She liked the image of him standing in the dark with a calf on a rope, dithering. She had told Clarence Hatch the story once, the full version, start to finish, and he had listened with great attention and then said, very gravely, "That is the strangest courtship I have ever heard of." And Daniel, who was present, had said, "Yes," without any apparent embarrassment, and Clarence had looked at them both and laughed until he had to sit down. They expanded the ranch in 1880, purchasing an additional 40 acres to the north that came available when the man who had been running it gave it up for poor health and went to live with his daughter in Galveston. 160 acres was a proper operation. Daniel had a vision for the land that included some crop cultivation on the better-watered sections, a small grain crop that would reduce their dependence on purchased feed, and they planted it together in the spring of 1881 with Robbie, who was a year and a half and had his mother's directness, and his father's patience in equal and interesting parts. Strapped to Birdie's back in a carrier, Daniel had fashioned following a description he'd read in his natural history. In June of 1881, a letter arrived for Daniel. It had been following him, forwarded through several hands, originating from New Mexico territory. It was from a man named Hargis, who had been a neighbor of Daniel and Clara's on the New Mexico ranch, a man Daniel had not seen in 7 years. The letter said that Hargis was retiring and that there were several items at the New Mexico property, which had been resold twice since Daniel left but was now sitting empty again. Including some furniture and tools Daniel had built with his own hands and a box of Clara's things that had been stored at the Hargis place for safekeeping when Daniel left so quickly. Daniel read the letter at the kitchen table, and Birdie, watching his face, saw something pass through it, not grief precisely, not the sharp kind, but something quieter and more complex, the feeling of being reminded that you have a history, that other chapters existed before this one. She said, "What does it say?" he told her. She listened. She said, "Do you want to go get them? The things that were hers," he said. "It would mean a trip to New Mexico. A week away, maybe more." She said, "I know." "Do you want to go?" He looked at her. She looked at him. She meant what the question said, not "Are you asking my permission?" Not "Do I have the right to stop you?" but "Do you need this? And if you need it, I will hold things here while you get it." He said, "I think I do." She said, "Then go. Robbie and I will be fine. Write to us." He went in July with the gray horse and 3 days' provisions and the ease of a man who knew how to travel alone. He was gone 11 days. Birdie worked the ranch and kept Robbie and did not resent the absence because she understood what it was, not a turning back but a clearing up, A final handling of things that had been left suspended for years and needed to be properly closed before they could stay closed. He came back on a hot afternoon while she was in the garden, Robbie digging enthusiastically in the dirt beside her. She heard the horse and looked up, and there was Daniel coming up the road with his saddlebags full, and that particular quality in how he sat the horse that she had come to read as well as she read whether settled, at peace. She stood up and dusted her hands on her skirt, and Robbie abandoned his excavation and ran toward the gate with the full commitment of a 2-year-old. And Daniel dismounted and caught him and held him up, and Robbie pulled his father's hat off and put it on his own head, which was about 4 sizes too large for it. Birdie came to the gate. Daniel settled Robbie on his hip and looked at her over the boy's head. He said, "I'm home," she said. "You're home," he said. "It went well," she said. "Tell me at supper." He did. The New Mexico property had been strange to see, smaller than memory had kept it, a little rougher, returned to its natural state in the way that abandoned buildings return to the land they'd been built on. Hargis was older but well. The box of Clara's things was smaller than he'd expected. A few books, some letters she'd received from her family in Missouri, a small portrait painted by a traveling artist, a pair of tortoiseshell hair combs. He had brought the box back. He had spent an afternoon with Hargis drinking coffee and talking about the old days, and then he had turned the horse north and felt the particular lightness of something completed. He said, "It was a life, a good one while it lasted, and it's done." Birdie said, "You can put her things with the photograph." He said, "I already had that thought." She said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment with those quiet gray eyes. He said, "Birdie Barrett. She said, "Daniel Barnett." He said, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He said, "For being the kind of woman you are." She said, "I didn't know there were other kinds." He laughed. She laughed. Robbie, who had been eating cornbread with the focused intensity of a person for whom cornbread was very serious business, looked up at both of them laughing, and decided this was an excellent situation and laughed too. The autumn of 1881 was one of those panhandle autumns that seemed designed to illustrate everything beautiful about that particular country, golden and vast and wide-skied, with the long grass going bronze and amber, and the cottonwoods burning yellow along the creek, and the light at every hour having that quality of concentrated clarity that happens when summer has burned away everything that isn't essential. They drove a good portion of the herd in October and came home with strong money and a market connection that looked reliable for the years ahead. Birdie made plans for the grain crop expansion she had been considering, and Daniel drew them out at the kitchen table in the evenings while Robbie sat beside him making his own drawings, which were abstract and appeared to involve a significant number of horses. In 1882, their second child arrived, a girl this time, born in May, easy as breathing compared to Robbie's dramatic entrance into the world. They named her Clara Mee Barnett, and Birdie had been the one to suggest it, because it seemed right, and because the woman who had first loved Daniel deserved something of continued existence, and the little girl arrived into the world with her father's dark hair, and a look of alert consideration that her parents agreed was very much her own personality establishing itself immediately. Daniel held Clara Mee on the first evening the way he had held Robbie, sitting in the chair by the window with the lamp lit and the baby against his chest, and Birdie watched him from the bed and thought about the man she had first seen in that cottonwood hollow with his open hands and his careful eyes, and thought about every day between that day and this one, and thought, "This is the ending of something and the beginning of something, except those two words are wrong. There is no ending, there is just more of this, more of the continuing of this particular and irreplaceable life." She said, "She looks like she knows things." He looked up from the baby. "What kind of things?" "Important ones." He looked back down at Clara Mee with great seriousness. "You may be right," she said. "She's going to be a handful." He said, "She's a Barnett, of course she is." Birdie said, "Barrett Barnett." He said, "A lot of bees." She said, "Yes." She let herself be happy, which sounds simple but had not always been. She let herself lie in the bed in the warm May evening with the lamp making soft, yellow circles on the walls, and the sound of the cattle in the field, and the baby's small sounds, and her husband's voice saying quiet things to the baby and her son asleep in the next room making the small, even sounds of a 2-year-old in deep sleep. And she felt all of it at once and let herself feel it. The ranch grew in the way that a thing grows when the people tending it are fully committed to it. By 1883, they had cleared the new grain fields, and the crop paid for itself in the first season. By 1884, they had expanded the barn and built a proper chicken house, and replaced the old porch with a new one that ran the full length of the house, and had a bench wide enough to sit on that Daniel built from the cedar they had taken from the creekbed stands, seasoned and planed. Birdie sat on that bench on the first morning it was finished and ran her hands along the smooth, warm wood and said, "This is the best porch I have ever had." And Daniel, still wiping sawdust from his hands, said, "You've only ever had one porch," and she said, "and now it's better." Robbie at 5 was a relentless source of activity, the kind of child who approached everything in the world with the conviction that it had been put there for him to test. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience, except when the directness and the patience collided, which produced a third thing that was purely his own. He was good with the cattle already in the practical, uninstructed way of a ranch child, instinctively reading their moods, and he had become particularly attached to Ptolemy the steer, the one Birdie had named after Daniel's horse, who was old now by cattle standards, but had maintained his dignity and his particular philosophical expression, and who allowed Robbie to lean against his flank in the evenings with the tolerance of the resigned. Clara Mee at 2 was a different kind of creature, quieter by nature but no less sharp, with a habit of watching people closely before she committed to anything, which her parents found alternately reassuring and slightly unnerving. She had taken a strong interest in the horses and had declared Harriet, Birdie's old roan, her personal horse, a declaration that Harriet appeared to accept with the equanimity of a horse who had been through a great deal and was not going to get worked up over a small girl. Hector at the livery died in the spring of 1884, quietly and in his sleep, which was agreed by everyone to be a fitting and dignified exit for a man of his character. Birdie and Daniel went to the funeral and stood in the dusty Caldwell cemetery in their good clothes with Clara Mee on Birdie's hip and Robbie, standing very straight at his father's side, as though he understood that this was an occasion requiring stillness. They had built something. That was the plain and honest fact. They had built a life and a place and a family, and the building of it had been both the hardest thing Birdie had ever done and the most natural, the most directly and obviously herself that she had ever been. She thought about this sometimes on the long walks she still took in the evenings, though now Robbie often came with her, his small boots making serious impressions in the same dust where she had walked alone for 2 years. The summer of 1884 was the last summer that felt like the beginning of things. The next few years settled into the established rhythm of the ranch, a rhythm that had the quality of something permanent, something with roots. The cattle operation was reliable. The grain crop was expanding. Daniel had traded enough with the market in Wichita and with buyers who came through Caldwell that the Barrett ranch had a reputation for good stock and straight dealing, which was the reputation worth having. Birdie turned 32 in the summer of 1884 and felt, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely young. She thought this was probably backwards, that people were supposed to feel younger when they were younger, but she thought she understood it. When she had been 24 and alone on this land, grinding out survival one day at a time, she had not had the resources to feel young. Youth was a luxury of people who were not running on the edge of their capacity. She had been too tired, too watchful, too much the warden of everything to feel it. Now she was not alone. Now the ranch was real and solid and producing. Now she had Daniel and the children and the new porch and the sound of the household in the morning, and she felt young in the way she had not been able to feel it when she was supposed to. She told Daniel this one evening and he listened and then said, "I feel that too." She said, "You were 32 when we met." He said, "I was drifting when we met. Drifting isn't young either." She said, "No." He said, "This is young. This is the thing." She said, "Yes." He put his arm around her on the new porch bench and she leaned against him, and they watched the evening come down over their land, all of it, the full 160 acres of it, every fence post and grass blade and creek bend of it, with the particular contentment of two people who had both arrived here from difficult directions and understood bone deep what they had. Penny, the first calf, oldest and most distinguished of the original 14, died in the autumn of 1884 of natural causes at the respectable age of 6½, which was a full life for a cow. Birdie found her in the field one morning, gone peacefully, and told Daniel at breakfast with a matter-of-factness that did not entirely hide the small grief of it. He nodded and was quiet for a moment and then said, "She was the beginning," and Birdie said, "She was," and they left it there, the way you leave things that are complete. Ptolemy the steer outlived them all, somehow, that original calf named after a horse, with his philosopher's expression, living on to become the patriarch of the field and Robbie's great friend, and one of the fixtures of the ranch in the way that certain animals became, less livestock than landmark. He was still there in 1886 when Birdie's third child arrived, another boy, born in March, quick and red-faced and immediately vigorous. They named him James Thomas Barrett Barnett, for Thomas had been Daniel's father's name, and called him Jamie. With 3 children, the house was as full as a house could be while remaining a house rather than a chaos, and Birdie managed this with the organizational efficiency she brought to everything, which meant there was an order to things, but it was a living order that accounted for the reality of small people. Daniel was the kind of father who read aloud and built things, and explained how engines worked and also how to gentle a nervous colt, and who had the patience for the repetitive questions of young children that some adults mysteriously do not possess. Robbie at 7 was his father's working companion and his mother's most thorough critic, delivering his assessments of supper and fence repair with equal solemnity. Clara Mee at 4 had started calling the horses by names she had invented for them, which did not always match their actual names, and had developed an artistic practice consisting of charcoal drawings on any flat surface she could reach. Jamie at birth was just Jamie, taking it all in with his mother's wide green eyes from the safety of someone's arms. There was a morning in the spring of 1887. Birdie was 35, and Daniel was 39, and Robbie was 7, and Clara Mee was 4, and Jamie was 1. When Birdie came out onto the new porch in the early morning before the family was awake, in her mother's old shawl that she still kept, and stood with her coffee and looked at the land in the first light. The east fence, properly mended those years ago, ran straight and true across the horizon. The barn was solid and well-maintained. The fields were beginning to show the first pale green of the grain crop coming up. The cattle were moving in the morning way unhurried, making their easy sounds. Penny was gone. Ptolemy was still there, standing in the field with that expression of permanent resignation that she had loved since he was 6 weeks old and arrived at her gate before the sun was up. She thought about that morning. She thought about the cold blue air and the little rust-colored calf pressing against her knee and the boot prints in the dust leading to nothing, to empty road, to the mystery of a man who had stopped. She heard the door behind her and Daniel came out in his shirt and coat, his hair not yet ordered, holding his own coffee cup. He came to stand beside her at the porch rail and they looked at the land together. He said, "Good morning, Mrs. Barrett Barnett." She said, "Good morning, Mr. Barnett." He said, "How long have you been up?" She said, "A little while, I was thinking." He said, "About what?" She said, "About the morning the first calf arrived. The first one, Penny." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I stood at your gate for 20 minutes that morning with that calf on a rope arguing with myself." She said, "I know, you told me." He said, "Did I? I don't remember telling you," she said. "You did. A year after we were married, you said you almost took her back 3 times." He said, "I almost did." She said, "What changed your mind?" He was quiet again. He looked at the field where Ptolemy was making his slow morning progress across the grass. He said, "I thought, you go through this life one time and the moments that feel right are rare enough that you ought not to walk away from them." A pause. "And it felt right, standing at your gate at 5 in the morning with a calf and a notion and absolutely no plan." Birdie said, "It was a very strange notion." He said, "Yes," she said, "it was the right one." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch they had built together, on the land they had mended and planted and fenced and worked together, in the life they had made together from nothing more than a gate and a calf and a piece of brown paper with a question on it. From inside the house came the sounds of mourning Robbie's feet on the floor, Clara Mee's voice saying something emphatic, Jamie's sleepy announcement that the day was, in his view, already too loud. Birdie smiled. Daniel smiled. She said, "We had better go in." He said, "We had better." But neither of them moved for another moment. And in that moment the morning light came fully up over the eastern fence and lit the field and the cattle and the long grass and the creek-lined cottonwoods and all 160 acres of it. And it was the color of old gold. And it was theirs. And it was enough. And it was more than enough. And it was exactly everything. They went inside. Robbie had already reached the kitchen and was engaged in a negotiation with the bread loaf that he had the better of by the time his parents arrived. Clara Mee had brought one of Daniel's books to the table and was examining the illustrations in the natural history with the serious concentration of a person who intended to understand everything eventually. Jamie, carried in on his father's hip, grabbed at a spoon with the conviction of a child who had recently discovered that grabbing things was an excellent policy. Birdie lit the stove. Daniel settled Jamie in the wooden chair fitted with its little rail. Robbie won the bread negotiation conclusively. Clara Mee found a page she liked. And outside the window in the field, Ptolemy stood in the morning light with his philosopher's expression, as though he had always known it would come to this. This exact morning, this kitchen, these people, this life that had started with 14 calves and a note and a woman who rode out to find a man and never came back alone. She had not come back alone. She had come back with everything.